On the coldest Christmas Eve Chicago had seen in decades, a man who had everything would discover he had nothing. A hungry boy rummaging through trash behind a luxury restaurant. A look that would pierce through a soul armored by years of bitterness. A decision that would divide an entire family and shock American high society. What would happen on that freezing night would change not just two lives, but would prove that God works in ways the human mind could never predict. This is a story about how destiny uses the smallest to humble the powerful, and how a heart of stone can transform when confronted with the purest innocence. Snow fell heavily over Michigan Avenue in Chicago on that Christmas Eve of 2019. White flakes danced beneath the golden lights of decorated storefronts, creating a scene that looked like something out of a postcard. Hurried families rushed from store to store, loaded with shopping bags and smiles, while street speakers played Christmas melodies that echoed among the towering skyscrapers of the financial district. But for Richard Montgomery, that fairy tale scene was nothing more than a painful reminder of how much he hated this time of year. At 53, Richard was the founder and CEO of Montgomery Capital, one of the largest investment firms in the Midwest. His fortune exceeded $400 million, built with blood, sweat, and a calculating coldness that had made him legendary, and feared, in the business world. His name was synonymous with ruthless success on Wall Street and in the pages of Forbes. But that night, as he drove his black Mercedes-Benz S-Class through the snow-covered streets, Richard felt the familiar weight of emptiness that no amount of money had been able to fill. It had been exactly 15 years since his wife, Catherine, had died in a car accident on Christmas Eve. She had been returning from a charity event at a children's shelter when an out-of-control truck collided head-on with her vehicle on Interstate 90. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Richard. She had died trying to help strangers while he was at home, annoyed because she was wasting time on charity instead of spending the evening with him. Since then, Richard had built even higher walls around his heart. He threw himself into work with an obsession that frightened even his closest partners. He cut ties with family, including his younger brother, James, and his 8-year-old niece, Emma, whom he barely knew. To Richard, relationships were high-risk, low-return investments. Better to avoid them completely. He stopped the car in front of his destination, Alinea, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants, with 3 Michelin stars and a 3-month waiting list. But when you have $400 million in the bank, there is no waiting list. Richard handed the keys to the valet without even looking at the young man receiving them. His gaze was fixed on his smartphone, responding to work emails as he walked toward the entrance. After all, business didn't stop for Christmas, birthdays, or funerals. That was his life philosophy. That's when he heard it. A dull, metallic sound coming from the side alley of the restaurant. Richard stopped, frowning. His businessman's instinct alerted him to possible problems, thieves, vandals, something that could disrupt his reservation. He approached the narrow alley, lit only by a dim security light. Industrial trash cans were lined up against the brick wall, and the accumulated snow made everything even more grim and desolate. And there, crouched behind one of the cans, Richard saw something that would freeze his blood more than Chicago's cutting wind. A boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. He was dressed in torn and dirty clothes, too thin for the brutal winter. His small feet wore torn sneakers, soaked through by the snow. His face was pale, almost bluish, and his hands trembled violently as he desperately rummaged through a garbage bag from the restaurant. Richard stood paralyzed, watching in disbelief as the boy found something, a piece of partially eaten French bread, and brought it to his mouth with a hunger so desperate it was painful to watch. He chewed quickly, like a starving animal, constantly checking around as if afraid someone would steal his meal. For a moment, Richard felt something strange stir inside him. Something he had buried a long time ago, along with Catherine. Was it pity? Compassion? He wasn't sure. It had been so long since he'd felt any emotion other than anger or indifference. The boy then raised his eyes and the two locked gazes. Those eyes. Good God, those eyes. They were brown, too large for his thin and dirty face. But what Richard saw in them wasn't just physical hunger. It was something deeper. An ancient sadness, too heavy for such a small body to carry. It was the look of someone who had already given up hoping for miracles. And then, something extraordinary happened. The boy didn't run, didn't beg, didn't cry. He simply kept looking at Richard with those enormous, sad eyes, holding the piece of wet bread against his chest as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. A single tear rolled down his dirty cheek, leaving a clean trail on the soot-covered skin. Richard felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in 15 years. His hand instinctively went to the inside pocket of his coat, where he kept his Italian leather wallet that cost more than most people earned in a month. He could give the boy some money. It would be easy. $100, maybe $500, and move on with his life. That's what any rich person would do to ease their conscience before returning to their $200 dinner. But as he continued looking at that fragile child shivering in the cold, something inside Richard broke. For the first time in 15 years, he felt the armor around his heart crack. "What's your name?" Richard heard his own voice ask, hoarse and unsteady. The boy blinked, surprised. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Richard with distrust, as if expecting a trap. "I'm not going to hurt you," Richard said, and realized he was being sincere. "I just want to know your name." The boy swallowed hard. His voice, when it finally came out, was just a weak whisper carried by the freezing wind. "Am Marcus, sir." Marcus. Richard closed his eyes for a second. The name echoed in his mind like silent thunder. It was as if the universe, or something greater, was shouting at him, saying that this encounter was no coincidence. When he opened his eyes again, Richard made a decision that would shock his family, divide his friends, and completely change the course of his life. A decision that would prove that God has mysterious plans, and that sometimes he uses the smallest and most fragile to transform the hardest hearts. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice firm for the first time, "you're having dinner with me tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked at Richard as if he hadn't understood the words he'd just heard. His lips trembled, but not just from the cutting cold that penetrated his fragile bones. It was disbelief, fear, confusion. I can't, sir," the boy finally whispered, clutching the piece of bread even tighter against his chest. "I don't have any money. I can't pay." Richard felt something break inside him when he heard those words. An 8-year-old child worried about paying for food. What kind of world was this? What kind of man had he become to live oblivious to this? "You don't need to pay anything," Richard said, trying to soften his naturally harsh voice. "I'll pay. You just need to come inside and eat a hot meal. Can you do that for me?" Marcus hesitated. His brown eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Richard thought the boy would collapse right there. But then, slowly, Marcus nodded his head, so slightly it was almost imperceptible. Richard removed his Burberry wool coat, which had cost $8,000, and placed it over the boy's narrow shoulders. The coat was absurdly large, completely swallowing Marcus's fragile figure, but at least it would protect him from the killer cold. "Let's go," Richard said, extending his hand. Marcus looked at that large, well-cared-for hand as if it were something alien. Slowly, with painful hesitation, he placed his small, freezing hand in Richard's. The touch was like an electric shock. Richard felt the icy temperature of those tiny fingers, the dirt encrusted in the skin, the broken and dirty nails. But above all, he felt the fragility. It was like holding an injured bird. They walked together toward the entrance of Alinea. Passing pedestrians looked with a mixture of shock and disgust at the contrast between the impeccably dressed businessman in his $3,000 Hugo Boss suit and the dirty, ragged street child at his side. Richard ignored all the stares. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't care what others thought. When they reached the restaurant door, the maitre d', a thin man named Philippe with a heavy French accent, opened his eyes in shock. "Mr. Montgomery," Philippe began, his tone polite but firm. "I'm sorry to inform you that we have a strict dress code and I own 20% of this establishment," Richard cut him off, his voice taking on that steel tone that made billionaires tremble in board meetings. "This boy will be dining with me tonight. At my reserved table. Will that be a problem, Philippe?" The maitre d' swallowed hard. He had known Richard Montgomery for years. He knew that when that man used that tone, there was no room for arguments. "No, sir. Absolutely no problem," Philippe replied, forcing a tense smile. "Follow me, please." Philippe guided them through the main dining room of the restaurant, where tables were occupied by Chicago's high society. Women in designer dresses and jewelry that cost more than cars. Men with Rolex watches and conversations about million-dollar deals. And then they saw Marcus. Silence spread through the room like a wave. Forks stopped in mid-air. Conversations died in the middle of sentences. All eyes turned to the dirty street boy walking alongside Richard Montgomery. Marcus shrank back, trying to make himself even smaller under the enormous coat. His eyes filled with tears of shame. He knew exactly what those people were thinking. He didn't belong there. He was trash. A nobody. A stain on the perfection of that place. But then Richard did something that shocked everyone. He stopped in the middle of the hall, turned to Marcus, and crouched down to be at eye level with the boy. In front of everyone. The powerful Richard Montgomery, kneeling before a street child. "Marcus," he said quietly but firmly, "do you see all these people here?" The boy nodded, trembling. "Do you know what they have that you don't?" Marcus shook his head, a tear rolling down his face. "Nothing," Richard answered, and there was a fierce conviction in his voice. "Absolutely nothing that truly matters. You are as worthy as anyone in this room. More worthy than most, actually. So lift your head and walk with me as if this place were yours. Because tonight, it is." Marcus blinked, processing those words. Slowly, very slowly, he raised his chin. And when Richard stood up and extended his hand again, Marcus held it with a little more firmness. They walked to the corner table, the best in the restaurant, with a view of the city lights through the huge glass windows. Philippe pulled out the chair for Marcus, who sat down carefully, as if afraid he might break something. "Bring hot water, clean towels, and the complete children's menu," Richard ordered a waiter who was watching the scene with his mouth open. "And a hot chocolate. The best you have." While they waited, Richard observed Marcus more closely. Under the dirt and torn clothes, he could see delicate facial features. Dark brown hair that would probably be wavy if it were clean. Intelligent eyes despite the deep exhaustion. There was something about this boy that resonated within Richard in a way he couldn't explain. "Marcus," Richard began gently, "where are your parents?" The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Richard saw the instant change in the boy's expression. His eyes filled with a pain so deep, so devastating, that Richard immediately regretted asking. "My mother," Marcus began, his voice just a choked whisper. She's in the hospital." "Which hospital?" Richard asked, leaning forward. "Northwestern Memorial," Marcus replied, and then the words began to pour out as if a dam had burst. "She has cancer. Lung cancer. Stage 4. The doctors said that there's nothing more they can do. She's been there for 3 weeks and I can't pay. They're going to send her away tomorrow because we don't have insurance and—" Marcus's voice broke completely. He covered his face with his hands and began to sob, his small body shaking with the force of tears he tried to control. Richard was paralyzed. Northwestern Memorial. He knew that hospital. It was one of the best in Chicago. And also one of the most expensive. And your father? Richard asked gently. I don't have a father, Marcus answered between sobs. Never met him. It was always just me and Mom. And now she's dying and I can't do anything. I can't help her. I can't even pay for food and... The waiter arrived with the hot chocolate and towels. Richard took them and, with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed, began to clean Marcus's face. The boy let him do it, trusting this stranger in a way that broke his heart. How long have you been on the street? Richard asked. 3 weeks, Marcus whispered. Since Mom went to the hospital. The social worker said I had to go to a shelter, but I ran away. I wanted to stay close to Mom. So I sleep on the park bench across from the hospital. When it's too cold, I sleep in the subway station. Richard felt his throat tighten. 3 weeks. This boy had been surviving on the streets of Chicago in the most brutal winter in decades, alone, eating garbage, sleeping exposed to the elements, all to stay near his dying mother. And where was Richard during those 3 weeks? In his $5 million penthouse apartment, complaining that the stock market was unstable. What's your mother's name? Richard asked. Sarah, Marcus replied, and when he said the name, his eyes lit up with a love so pure, so intense, that Richard had to look away. Sarah Mitchell. She's the best mother in the world. She always took care of me, even when we had nothing. She worked 3 jobs to give me food and clothes. She never gave up on me, even when things got bad. Richard closed his eyes. Catherine. He remembered Catherine and how she always said she wanted to have children. How she dreamed of being a mother. How she begged them to adopt when they discovered they couldn't have biological children. And he always said no. Always found an excuse. Work. Wrong timing. Wasn't ready. And then she died, and he never got the chance to give her what she wanted most. But now, looking at this brave boy who slept on park benches to stay close to his dying mother, Richard felt something ignite inside him. A spark he thought had died 15 years ago. A chance for redemption. Marcus, Richard said, his voice firm and full of a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Marcus looked at him with those enormous, frightened eyes, and slowly nodded. Then have dinner with me now. Eat until you can't anymore. And after. Richard paused, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything. After that, we'll go to the hospital to visit your mother. Together. The dinner that followed was something Richard Montgomery would never forget for the rest of his life. Marcus ate as if each forkful might be his last. Creamy pumpkin soup with spices. Filet mignon medallions in red wine sauce. Truffle mashed potatoes. Grilled vegetables. He devoured everything with a hunger that went far beyond the physical. It was the hunger of someone who didn't know when they would eat again. Richard watched in silence, his own plate untouched. Every movement of that boy was a painful reminder of his own indifference to the world's problems. How many times had he thrown away food that could have fed a child like Marcus for a week? How many times had he complained about a dish at a luxury restaurant while children rummaged through trash outside? Mr. Montgomery. A cold, feminine voice cut through his thoughts. Richard looked up and felt his stomach sink. It was Margaret Whitmore, one of the minority partners in his company and wife of Jonathan Whitmore, heir to an oil fortune. She stood beside the table, dressed in a red evening ensemble that had probably cost more than $20,000, with a diamond necklace that sparkled under the restaurant lights. And she was looking at Marcus with the same expression someone would use upon finding a rat in their salad. Margaret, Richard responded, his tone neutral and controlled. Merry Christmas. It would certainly be merrier if I didn't have to dine next to that, she said, gesturing vaguely in Marcus's direction without even looking directly at him. Richard, darling, I understand you have your charitable moments, but bringing a street child to Alinea? On Christmas Eve. What will people think? Marcus stopped eating. He lowered his fork slowly, his eyes fixed on his plate, his face red with shame. His hands began to tremble again, but this time it wasn't from cold. It was from pure humiliation. Richard felt fury rising inside him like lava surging in a volcano about to explode. What will people think? He repeated, his voice dangerously low. I'll tell you exactly what I hope they think, Margaret. I hope they think there's still humanity in this world. That there are still people willing to help a hungry child instead of worrying about the opinion of hypocritical socialites who use charity as a fashion accessory. Margaret went pale. How dare you? This boy, Richard continued, standing up and placing his hand protectively on Marcus's shoulder, has more dignity, courage, and character in his little finger than you and your entire social circle combined. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a dinner to finish with my guest. Margaret opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water. Her eyes filled with tears of anger and humiliation. She turned abruptly and stomped away, her Louboutin heels echoing through the silent restaurant. Richard sat down again and looked at Marcus, who was staring at him with a mixture of shock and admiration. You didn't have to do that, sir, Marcus whispered. She's right. I shouldn't be here. No, Richard said firmly, taking the napkin and wiping away a tear rolling down the boy's face. She's wrong. And I should have stood up for people like you a long time ago. Now finish eating. We have an important place to go. An hour later, they were in the parking lot of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The imposing glass and steel structure rose against Chicago's night sky, its lit windows like earthly stars. Snow continued to fall, creating a white blanket over the city that seemed unrealistically peaceful. Marcus stood paralyzed beside Richard's Mercedes, looking at the hospital with a mixture of hope and terror in his eyes. She's on the 11th floor, Marcus said quietly. Oncology ward. Room 1147. Richard nodded, and they entered together. The lobby was nearly empty. Most visitors had left to spend Christmas at home. Only a few lonely souls remained, waiting on the couches with tired and worried expressions. When they entered the elevator, Marcus grabbed Richard's hand tightly. His small fingers squeezed with desperate intensity, as if afraid Richard would disappear if he let go. The hallway on the 11th floor was silent and sterile, with that characteristic hospital smell that mixed disinfectant and illness. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. Room 1147. Marcus stopped in front of the door, trembling. Not from cold this time, but from fear. Fear of what he would find on the other side. Fear that his mother would be worse. Fear that this might be the last time. It's okay, Richard said gently, squeezing the boy's shoulder. I'm here with you. Marcus took a deep breath, gathered all the courage his small body could muster, and pushed the door open. The woman in the bed was little more than a skeleton covered by pale, translucent skin. Her hair had completely fallen out, probably due to chemotherapy, and she wore a light blue scarf on her head. Tubes emerged from her arms, connected to machines that beeped softly around her. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. But when the door opened and she heard the footsteps, her eyes opened. And when they saw Marcus, they lit up with a love so intense, so pure, that Richard had to lean against the wall. Marcus, she whispered, her voice weak but full of joy. My baby. You came back. Mom. Marcus ran to the bed and threw himself into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't help. I tried so hard, but I couldn't. Sure, my love, Sarah said, stroking her son's hair with trembling hands. You have nothing to apologize for. You are my miracle. My gift from God. That's when she noticed Richard standing at the door. Her eyes widened in confusion and slight fear. "Who?" she began. "Mom, this is Mr. Montgomery," Marcus said quickly, wiping away his tears. "He gave me food. He helped me. He's good, Mom." Sarah looked at Richard, studying him with eyes that, despite the illness, still possessed sharp intelligence. She saw the expensive suit, the luxury watch, the shoes that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. She saw a man of power and money. And she was afraid. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice cautious, "I appreciate you feeding my son. But if you're here because of social services, please, I beg you." "I'm not here because of social services," Richard interrupted gently, approaching the bed. "I'm here because I found your son looking for food in the trash behind a restaurant. I'm here because he told me about you. And I'm here because—" He stopped, searching for the right words. How could he explain what he himself barely understood? How could he tell a complete stranger that seeing her son in that alley had shattered something inside him that had been frozen for 15 years? "Because what?" Sarah pressed, her eyes filling with tears of fear. "Because I want to help," Richard finally said, simple and direct. Sarah laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, full of pain and despair. "Help, Mr. Montgomery. I have $340,000 in medical bills. I don't have insurance. I don't have family. I don't have anything. The doctors said I only have a month left, maybe less. And when I die, Marcus will be alone. Completely alone. Unless you're God in disguise, there's nothing you can do." "Maybe I'm not God," Richard replied, and for the first time in 15 years, he smiled, a genuine smile, not the cold, calculated smile he used in business meetings. "But I have $400 million. And tonight, I discovered that money can actually buy something worthwhile." Sarah was paralyzed. What are you saying?" Richard pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. He looked at Marcus, who was holding his mother's hand desperately, and then back at Sarah. "I'm saying I'll pay all your medical bills. I'm saying I'll hire the best oncologists in the United States to evaluate your case. I'm saying Marcus will never sleep on the street or look for food in the trash again. And I'm saying that—" He paused, feeling the weight of the next words. "If the worst happens, and I pray to God it doesn't, Marcus will have a home. With me." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah looked at him as if he had just spoken in an alien language. Marcus had stopped breathing. "Why?" Sarah finally whispered, tears flowing freely down her face. "Why would you do this for us? We're nobody. Nothing to you." Richard looked at Marcus, and then at Sarah, and felt something he hadn't felt since Catherine's death. He felt alive. "Because 15 years ago, I lost my wife. And with her, I lost my humanity. Because I spent 15 years building an empire of money while my heart died. And because tonight, a brave 8-year-old boy rummaging through trash reminded me of what really matters in this life." He leaned forward, his voice full of fierce conviction. "Because maybe, just maybe, you too are the redemption I didn't know I was looking for." Sarah Mitchell cried like she hadn't cried in months. Tears of relief, of hope, of fear, of disbelief, all mixed in an emotional storm that shook her fragile, sick body. Marcus held her hand, also crying, not fully understanding what was happening, but feeling that something monumental had changed. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had made million-dollar decisions without blinking. He had closed deals that changed the course of entire companies with the coldness of a surgeon. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the emotional intensity of that moment. "I'm going to call my private physician right now," Richard said, already pulling out his cell phone. "Dr. Harrison Bennett. He's one of the best oncologists in the country. If anyone can do something, it's him. But before he could dial, the door to the room burst open. A nurse entered, followed by a man in a gray suit with a stern expression. He carried a clipboard and had that official air that immediately put Richard on alert. "Mrs. Mitchell," the man said, his voice bureaucratic and emotionless. "I'm Gerald Patterson, from the administrative department. We need to discuss payment of your hospital bills. As you're aware, your credit period has expired and—" "How much?" Richard interrupted, standing up. Patterson looked at him, frowning. "Excuse me, sir, but this is a private conversation with the patient." "I asked how much," Richard repeated, his voice taking on that commanding tone that made CEOs tremble. "How much does she owe?" Patterson hesitated, studying Richard with suspicion. "And you would be?" "Richard Montgomery. Montgomery Capital. And I'm going to ask this question for the last time. How much does she owe?" Recognition flashed in Patterson's eyes. Everyone in Chicago's financial sector knew Richard Montgomery. The man swallowed hard and consulted his clipboard. With treatments, hospitalization, medications, and procedures, the current total is $342,683. And to continue treatments, hire the best specialists, and guarantee first-class care until she's cured or— Richard paused, looking at Sarah and Marcus. "Until the end? Mr. Montgomery, with all due respect, Mrs. Mitchell's case is terminal. Stage 4 lung cancer with metastasis. The doctors don't recommend any more aggressive treatments." "I didn't ask what the doctors recommend," Richard cut him off. "I asked how much it would cost." Patterson sighed. "Considering experimental chemotherapy, immunotherapy, possible surgeries, high-quality palliative care, we're talking about potentially $500,000 to $1 million. And, Mr. Montgomery, I must be honest, the chances of recovery are—" "I don't care about the chances," Richard said, pulling his checkbook from his inside pocket. He opened it on the hospital food tray and began writing with his Mont Blanc pen. "I'll pay the current debt now. And I'll make a bank transfer tomorrow for $1 million to guarantee all necessary treatments. I want the best oncologists in the United States to evaluate her case. I want her to have access to the most advanced treatments available." "Understood." Patterson was speechless. Sarah had covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing. Marcus was looking at Richard as if seeing an angel. But sir," Patterson stammered, "you understand this could be wasted money? The chances are minimal of—" Richard tore off the check and handed it to Patterson with such force that the man took a step back. "As long as there's a chance, even if it's 1%, we'll fight. Now leave and arrange everything I asked for. Immediately." Patterson took the check with trembling hands, looked at the amount, $350,000, and practically ran out of the room. When the door closed, silence returned. Sarah looked at Richard with an expression that mixed gratitude, confusion, and fear. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice trembling, "I can't accept this. It's too much. It's—" "Sarah," Richard interrupted gently, using her first name for the first time, "when was the last time someone did something for you without expecting anything in return?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, thinking, and then her tears started again. "Never," she whispered. "Never in my life." "Then let me be the first," Richard said. "Let me help. Not out of obligation. Not out of pity. But because it's the right thing to do. Because your son showed me something today that I had forgotten, that there's still goodness in this world. And because He stopped, swallowing hard. "Because it's been 15 years since I lost my wife. And since then, I've been living like a ghost. But tonight, you reminded me what it's like to be alive." 2 hours later, Richard stood outside the hospital, smoking a cigarette, a vice he had quit 10 years ago but returned to that night due to tension. Marcus was beside him, now dressed in clean clothes that a compassionate nurse had found in the donation stock. Richard had just made 5 phone calls. The first to Dr. Harrison Bennett, his private physician, waking him from bed and requesting an urgent evaluation of Sarah's case. The second to his lawyer, James Chen, instructing him to begin proceedings to become Marcus's legal guardian if the worst happened. The third to his personal assistant, ordering her to prepare one of the guest rooms in his apartment. The fourth to a caregiver agency, hiring private nurses for Sarah. And the fifth was the hardest. It was to his brother, James. Richard. James's sleepy voice answered. It's almost 11 at night. What happened? I need to talk to you, Richard said, his voice more vulnerable than it had been in years. Tomorrow. It's important. Is everything okay? James asked, now fully awake. He knew his brother well enough to know that Richard never called without reason. Especially on Christmas Eve. I don't know, Richard admitted honestly. But I did something today that's going to change everything. And I need you to understand why. There was a long pause. I'll be there at 9 in the morning, James finally said. Where are you? Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Are you sick? No. It's complicated. I'll explain tomorrow. Richard hung up and looked at Marcus, who was gazing at the city lights with an expression of wonder in his eyes. The boy had never been this high in a building before. To him, that view was magical. Marcus, Richard said softly. The boy turned to him. Are you sure you want to stay with me? I'm not an easy man. I'm not warm. I don't know how to be a father. I don't know if I can be what you need. Marcus looked at Richard for a long moment. And then, completely unexpectedly, he stepped forward and hugged Richard. His small arms could barely wrap around the tall man's waist. You gave me food when I was hungry, Marcus whispered against Richard's coat. You defended me when that lady was mean. You're saving my mother. You're the kindest man I've ever met. Richard felt something break inside him. The last wall, the last brick of protection around his shattered heart. He knelt down and hugged Marcus back, and for the first time in 15 years, Richard Montgomery cried. He cried for Catherine, who never got the chance to be a mother. He cried for the 15 years wasted in bitterness and loneliness. He cried for the children he had ignored, for the people he had treated coldly, for the man he had become. And he cried for the second chance God was giving him through a brave boy who searched for food in the trash. They stood there, embraced in Chicago's cutting cold, while snow continued to fall softly, covering the world in pure white. As if the universe was giving Richard Montgomery a blank slate to start over. But what Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the journey was only beginning. And that the greatest trials were still to come. Because Richard's family wouldn't accept this silently. Because there were forces working against him that he couldn't even imagine. And because miracles, even when they happen, never come without a price. The storm was only beginning. And Richard Montgomery would have to decide if he was ready to face it. Christmas Day dawned gray and cold over Chicago. Richard hadn't slept. He had spent the entire night in his home office, making calls, moving bureaucratic mountains, using every ounce of his influence to ensure Sarah received the best possible treatment. Marcus was sleeping in the guest room, a space larger than the entire apartment where he and Sarah had lived before. The boy had taken a hot bath, eaten until he couldn't anymore, and passed out from exhaustion on the king-size bed wrapped in silk blankets. Richard was sitting in his leather armchair, looking out the skyscraper window at the city waking up, when the doorbell rang. 9 o'clock sharp. James was always punctual. He opened the door and found his younger brother, accompanied by Emma, his 8-year-old niece. The girl had curly blonde hair and bright blue eyes, features inherited from the late Catherine, who was James's sister. "Richard," James said, entering carefully, as if stepping into enemy territory. And in a way, he was. It had been 3 years since the brothers had spoken properly. "James." "Emma," Richard greeted them, trying to soften his naturally hard expression. "Thank you for coming." "Uncle Richard," Emma exclaimed, running to hug him. Unlike her father, the girl held no grudge. She still remembered the uncle who used to visit them before he completely shut himself off. Richard knelt down and hugged his niece, feeling a pang of guilt. When was the last time he had spent time with her? 2 years. 3. "So," James said, crossing his arms, "what's so important that you needed to wake me up on Christmas Day?" Richard took a deep breath. "I adopted a child." The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at him as if Richard had just announced he'd bought the moon. "You what?" "More specifically, I'm going to adopt," Richard corrected. "The papers are in progress. He's sleeping in the guest room now." "Richard," James said slowly, as if speaking to a child, "you can't just adopt a child overnight. There are processes, evaluations, background checks." "I know," Richard interrupted him. "My lawyer is taking care of everything. And before you ask, yes, I'm serious. More serious than I've ever been about anything in my life." James ran his hand through his hair, incredulous. "Who is this child? Where did he come from? What happened to you last night?" That's when Marcus appeared in the hallway doorway, wearing one of Richard's t-shirts that fit him like a dress. His hair was wet from the shower and he looked frightened to see strangers in the house. "Mr. Montgomery," he said timidly. "Marcus," Richard said gently, extending his hand. "Come. I want to introduce you to someone." Marcus approached slowly, stopping beside Richard. Emma was watching him with curiosity, her eyes shining with interest. "This is my brother, James, and my niece, Emma," Richard explained. "James, Emma, this is Marcus Mitchell. He's going to live with me now." "Hi," Marcus whispered, waving shyly. Emma, without the adult's reserve, ran to Marcus with a huge smile. "Hi. How old are you? Do you like video games? Do you have a Switch?" Marcus blinked, confused. I'm 8 years old. And I don't know what a Switch is." "You've never played video games?" Emma asked, shocked. For her, this was inconceivable. "No," Marcus admitted, looking at the floor. "We didn't have money for that." The atmosphere changed instantly. James looked at the boy, really looked, and saw the old clothes folded on the sofa, the feet still with marks of wounds, the face that even clean showed signs of malnutrition. "Richard," James said quietly, pulling his brother aside, "can we talk? In private?" Richard nodded. "Marcus, why don't you stay with Emma? She can show you some games." "Yes," Emma exclaimed, taking Marcus's hand. "Come on, I'll show you Dad's iPad." While the children walked away, James led Richard to the private balcony. The view of Chicago stretched below them, the city still covered in snow from the day before. "What the hell is going on, Richard?" James asked, his voice a mixture of concern and frustration. "You ignore me for 3 years. Don't call on Emma's birthday. Don't show up at family gatherings. And now, suddenly, on Christmas Eve, you decide to adopt a street child." "He's not a street child," Richard retorted, feeling defensiveness rising. "He has a name, a history, a mother who's dying of cancer at Northwestern Memorial." "Exactly," James exclaimed. "A dying mother. Richard, have you thought about this? What happens when she dies? Are you going to raise this boy?" You, who spend 18 hours a day working. Who can't maintain a relationship with your own family. The words hit Richard like physical punches. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. James pressed. Explain to me how the man who refused to have children with Catherine, who said children were a distraction, who cut ties with all of us, suddenly wants to be a foster father. Richard turned sharply, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Because he was looking for food in the trash, James. Because he slept on park benches to stay close to his dying mother. Because when I looked into his eyes, I saw everything I've wasted in the last 15 years. His voice broke. I saw Catherine. I saw the child she always wanted. I saw the second chance God is giving me to be something more than a rich, bitter bastard. James fell silent, processing his brother's words. He saw something in Richard's face he hadn't seen in years, genuine emotion, vulnerability, pain. Richard, James said more softly, I understand. Believe me, I understand. But this isn't just about you. This is about a real child, with real needs. If you do this, you can't give up when it gets hard. You can't just invest in him and then walk away when he doesn't give the emotional return you expect. I know, Richard said, wiping his eyes. And I'm terrified. But James, for the first time in 15 years, I feel like there's a purpose. Something beyond money and business. I need to do this. I need to try. James sighed deeply. He looked through the glass window and saw Emma showing something on the iPad to Marcus, who was smiling, a shy but genuine smile. You're going to need help, James finally said. You can't do this alone. I know. And the family, especially the old guard, they're not going to take this well. Margaret Whitmore has probably already spread around what happened last night at Ilinia. As if summoned by his words, Richard's cell phone began to ring. It was his mother, Victoria Montgomery, the family matriarch and one of the most powerful and influential women in Chicago high society. Richard looked at the phone vibrating in his hand, feeling his stomach sink. Don't answer now, James advised. You need to be prepared for this conversation. But Richard knew his mother. Victoria Montgomery wasn't the type of person who accepted being ignored. If he didn't answer, she would show up in person. And that would be worse. He answered. Mother. Richard Alexander Montgomery. Victoria's voice cut through the line like a blade of ice. I'm in the lobby of your building. I'm coming up now. And you have exactly 5 minutes to explain to me why all of Chicago is talking about my son taking a street child to Ilinia and declaring he's going to adopt him. The line went dead. Richard looked at James, who had gone pale. They both knew Victoria. When she used that tone, it meant war. She's coming, Richard said unnecessarily. I know, James replied. And Richard, she's not going to let this go. Inside the apartment, Marcus laughed at something Emma had said, a pure and innocent sound that contrasted dramatically with the tension approaching. Richard closed his eyes. He knew that what was about to happen could destroy everything he had tried to build in the last 12 hours. His mother had power, influence, and an iron will that had crushed opponents much stronger than him. And she would not accept that a Montgomery, especially her firstborn son, would lower himself to adopt a poor child. The storm Richard had felt approaching yesterday was finally arriving. And he would have to decide, fight for Marcus and face his mother's fury and that of all high society, or give up and return to the lonely safety of his previous life. The doorbell rang. Victoria Montgomery had arrived. And the real test was only beginning. Victoria Montgomery entered the apartment like a hurricane dressed in Chanel. At 72 years old, she maintained the regal posture of someone who had spent her entire life dominating boardrooms and social events. Her silver hair was impeccably styled, her jewelry sparkled under the lights, and her icy blue eyes swept the environment with the precision of a laser. "Richard," she said, her voice cutting like broken glass. "Living room. Now." James instinctively shrank back. Emma, sensing the tension, pulled Marcus closer to her on the sofa. The boy was paralyzed with fear. He recognized the type of power this woman emanated. She was the kind of person who usually sent him away from stores and sidewalks with a single look. "Mother," Richard began, trying to keep his voice steady, "before you start, you need to understand that." "I don't need to understand anything," Victoria cut him off, walking until she was face to face with him. Even in her heels, she was almost a foot shorter than Richard, but somehow she managed to make him feel small. "I received 5 phone calls this morning. 5. Margaret Whitmore, the Harrisons, the Pembertons, all telling me the same absurd story about you humiliating a company partner to defend a street child." "He's not a street child," Richard said, feeling anger rising. "He has a name. Marcus Mitchell. And he was looking for food in the trash because his mother is dying of cancer and he had no one else." "How sad," Victoria said, but her tone made it clear she felt no pity at all. "There are shelters for that. Orphanages. Social services. It's not a Montgomery's responsibility." "It's my responsibility," Richard exploded, and the volume of his voice made Emma jump. "I chose for it to be my responsibility." Victoria blinked, surprised by the outburst. It had been years since Richard had raised his voice to her. But she quickly recovered her composure. "You chose," she repeated slowly, dangerously. "And tell me, Richard, when exactly did you start making decisions that affect the entire family without consulting anyone? Do you have any idea what this will do to the Montgomery reputation? To the company? Reputation?" Richard laughed bitterly. "Is that what you care about? What people will think?" "Yes," Victoria exclaimed, and for the first time her voice showed real emotion. "Yes, I care. Because reputation is everything in this world, Richard. It's what your grandfather built. What your father maintained. What I protected after he died. And I won't allow you to destroy everything because of a sentimental impulse." "It's not an impulse," Richard shouted back. "It's the first right decision I've made in 15 years. The silence that followed was tense as a rope about to break. And then, a small, trembling voice cut through the tension. I can leave." Everyone turned. Marcus was standing, tears streaming down his face, his fists clenched at his sides. Emma was trying to hold him, but he gently pulled away. "I don't want to cause trouble," Marcus continued, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to cause trouble. The lady is right. I'm just trash. I should go back to the street. No," Richard said, crossing the room in 3 long strides and kneeling in front of Marcus. "Don't say that. Never say that. You're not trash. You're—" He stopped, searching for the words. And then, looking into Marcus's brown eyes, shining with tears, Richard knew exactly what he was. "You're my son," Richard said, and as he spoke the words aloud, he felt the truth of them resonate in his chest. "You're my son, and no one is going to take you from me." Victoria went white. "Richard, you've completely lost your mind." "Maybe I have," Richard agreed, standing up but keeping his hand protectively on Marcus's shoulder. "Or maybe I've finally gotten it back. Mother, when Catherine died, I died with her. I spent 15 years building walls, cutting ties, becoming exactly the kind of man you always wanted me to be. Cold, calculating, focused only on money and power." He paused, his voice becoming softer but no less intense. "And it was miserable. Every day was a lonely hell that I pretended was success. But last night, when I saw this boy looking for food in the trash, something broke inside me. And for the first time since I lost Catherine, I felt like there was a reason to wake up in the morning. Victoria looked at her son, really looked, and saw something that shocked her. She saw genuine emotion. She saw determination. She saw the Richard from before, the Richard who existed before Catherine died and turned him into an empty shell. "Mother," Richard continued, his voice now almost a plea, "when was the last time you saw me smile? Really smile, not that fake smile I use at events and meetings." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't. Because the truth was she didn't remember. It had been years. Maybe 15 years. "This boy gave me something that all your gala dinners and charity events never did," Richard said. "He gave me purpose, hope, a reason to be something more than rich." Marcus was looking at Richard with an expression of pure adoration. No one had ever fought for him that way. No one had ever defended him like that. Victoria remained silent for a long moment. Her face was an impenetrable mask, but behind her icy blue eyes, a fierce battle was taking place. Finally, she turned to Marcus. "Come here, boy." Marcus hesitated, looking at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. The boy approached Victoria slowly, like a small animal approaching a predator. Victoria knelt down, something she hadn't done in years, risking her elderly joints and her even greater pride, and got to eye level with Marcus. "What's your full name?" she asked, her voice still hard but no longer cruel. "Am Marcus James Mitchell, ma'am," he replied, trembling. "And your mother? What's her name?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. She's in the hospital. She has cancer and—" His voice failed. Victoria studied the boy's face, the honest eyes, the chin trying to be brave despite the fear, the vulnerability he couldn't hide. And then she did something that shocked everyone in the room, especially Richard. She took Marcus's hand in hers. "Marcus James Mitchell," she said calmly, "if my son has decided you're part of this family, then you're part of this family. The Montgomerys don't go back on their word. Understood?" Marcus blinked, confused. I don't understand, ma'am." A small smile, the first Richard had seen in years, touched Victoria's lips. "It means you just gained a very demanding grandmother, young man. And demanding grandmothers have rules. First rule, you call me Grandma Victoria, not ma'am." "Grandma Victoria," Marcus repeated, as if testing the words. "Second rule, you're going to study at the best schools. Third rule, you're going to learn to behave like a Montgomery. And fourth rule, the most important." She pulled Marcus into a hug that caught him completely by surprise. "You will never, ever look for food in the trash again. You'll never be cold again. Never feel alone again. Because now you have a family. A complicated, rich, and sometimes cold family, but a family." Marcus began to cry, sobbing against Victoria's shoulder. And to everyone's amazement, Victoria also had tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. Richard felt like he was having an out-of-body experience. His mother, Victoria Montgomery, the Ice Queen of Chicago, was crying and hugging a street child. James was speechless. Emma was smiling, tears of joy in her eyes. When Victoria finally released Marcus, she stood up and turned to Richard. And then she did something even more shocking. She hugged her son. For the first time in 15 years, Victoria Montgomery hugged Richard, and he felt all the love she had hidden behind her armor of coldness and impossible expectations. "You're right," she whispered in his ear. "Catherine would be proud." Richard closed his eyes, holding his mother, and felt 15 years of pain and resentment begin to dissolve. "Now," Victoria said, wiping her eyes and recovering her composure, "we have a lot of work to do. I need to call my lawyers to expedite the adoption. I need to find the best oncologists on the East Coast for his mother. And I need to organize a proper Christmas dinner to introduce Marcus to the family." "Mother," Richard began, "about the family. Not everyone is going to accept this as well as you did." Victoria turned to him, and her eyes had that steel glint again. "Then they'll learn," she said simply. "The hard way, if necessary. Marcus is a Montgomery now. And nobody messes with a Montgomery." The days following Christmas were a storm of changes that left Marcus completely dazed. Victoria Montgomery didn't waste time when she made a decision. Within 48 hours, she had hired the 3 best oncologists in the United States to evaluate Sarah's case, mobilized a team of lawyers to expedite the adoption process, and organized a New Year's dinner where Marcus would be officially introduced to the extended Montgomery family. Richard, for his part, found himself in completely unfamiliar territory: fatherhood. On the first morning, he woke up at 6, his usual time, and went to the home office to check emails. 2 hours later, he realized Marcus was still sleeping. Immediate panic. Was something wrong? Did children sleep until 8 in the morning? Should he wake him? Richard called James, who laughed for the first time in years hearing his older brother completely lost about children's routines. "Let him sleep, Richard," James advised. "His body is recovering from weeks of malnutrition and cold exposure. He needs rest." On the second day, Richard tried to make breakfast. He, who normally only had black coffee and ate a croissant from an expensive bakery, stood looking at the immaculate and expensive kitchen he barely used, with no idea what an 8-year-old child ate for breakfast. Pancakes, eggs, cereal. He had none of that. He ended up calling a delivery service and ordering practically everything from the children's menu. When Marcus woke up, he found the dining table covered with waffles, pancakes, scrambled eggs, bacon, fruit, juice, chocolate milk, and at least 6 different types of cereal. Is all this for me?" Marcus asked, his eyes wide. "I didn't know what you liked," Richard admitted, feeling ridiculously inadequate. "So I ordered everything." Marcus looked at the abundance, and then at Richard, and began to laugh. It was a pure, childlike laugh that filled the apartment with a sound it had never contained before. And Richard, despite feeling foolish, laughed too. They ended up eating pancakes together, with Marcus patiently explaining that, "No, Mr. Montgomery, nobody eats 6 types of cereal at once." On the third day, Richard had to take Marcus to buy clothes. He had given the boy some of his own clothes, expensive t-shirts that fit like dresses, but obviously that wasn't sustainable. They went to the Magnificent Mile, Chicago's famous shopping avenue. Richard walked into a designer children's clothing boutique, but Marcus stopped at the door, looking at the prices on the tags with horror. "Mr. Montgomery," he whispered, tugging on Richard's sleeve, "this t-shirt costs $200. We can't spend that much money on me." Richard knelt in front of Marcus right there, in the middle of the luxury store, ignoring the curious looks from other customers. "Marcus," he said firmly, "I need you to understand something. Money is not a problem. It will never be a problem. I could buy this entire store and not even feel a difference in my bank account. So stop worrying about prices. Choose what you like." "But," Marcus began, his hands trembling. "No buts," Richard cut him off gently. "You're my son now, and parents buy clothes for their children. That's how it works." Marcus looked at Richard with those huge brown eyes, processing the words. "Your son." Richard felt his chest tighten. It was the first time he had said that directly to Marcus. "Yes," he said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "My son." Marcus threw himself into Richard's arms and hugged him with surprising strength for someone so small. Richard hugged him back, and didn't care when the other customers stopped to watch the touching scene. They left the store 3 hours later with 20 bags full of clothes, shoes, and accessories. Marcus still looked guilty with each purchase, but there was a brightness of happiness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The hospital visit that afternoon was harder. Sarah had been transferred to a luxury private suite at Northwestern Memorial, courtesy of Richard and his mother. She now had access to the best treatments, 24-hour private nurses, and a stunning view of Lake Michigan. But she was visibly weaker. "Marcus, my love," she said when they entered, her voice just a fragile whisper. But her eyes lit up seeing her son dressed in new, clean clothes, with a healthy glow returning to his cheeks. Marcus ran to the bed and hugged his mother carefully, aware of how fragile she was. "Mom, are you better?" he asked hopefully. Sarah looked over Marcus's head at Richard, who stood respectfully near the door. The look she gave him was one of pure gratitude mixed with deep, knowing sadness. "I'm fine, baby," she lied gently, stroking her son's hair. "The doctors are taking very good care of me." But Richard knew that look. He had seen it in Catherine in the final days at the hospital, when she tried to be strong even knowing she was dying. It was the look of someone saying goodbye, but not wanting the other person to know. Dr. Harrison Bennett had called Richard that morning with the evaluation results. The cancer was more advanced than local doctors had thought. There was metastasis in the bones, liver, brain. The elite oncologists Victoria had hired were unanimous. It was a matter of weeks, maybe days. "We can try aggressive chemotherapy," Dr. Bennett had said cautiously, but at best, it would buy a few more months. And the suffering would be immense. "My professional recommendation is to focus on palliative care and quality of life in the time that remains." Richard had agreed, but said nothing to Marcus. How do you tell an 8-year-old child that his mother has days to live? "Mr. Montgomery," Sarah called softly, bringing Richard back to the present. "Can you come here?" Richard approached the bed. Sarah extended a trembling hand, and he held it gently. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her thin face. "Thank you for taking care of my boy. Thank you for giving him everything I never could." "Sarah," Richard began, feeling his throat tighten. "No," she interrupted gently. "Let me speak. I know I don't have much time. The doctors don't need to tell me. I can feel it. And I need to know." Her voice broke. "I need to know that Marcus will be okay when I'm gone." Marcus, who was watching the conversation without fully understanding, squeezed his mother's hand. "Mom, don't talk like that. You're going to get better. Mr. Montgomery is taking care of everything." "Marcus," Sarah said, turning to look deeply into her son's eyes, "you know I love you more than anything in this world, don't you?" "I know, Mom," Marcus said, his voice small and frightened. "And you know that I'll always love you, no matter what happens? Even when I'm not here physically anymore." Marcus began to cry. "No, Mom, don't talk like that. Please, don't." "I need you to be brave," Sarah continued, her own tears falling freely now. "I need you to be the strong and incredible boy you've always been. And I need you to trust Mr. Montgomery. He'll take care of you. He'll give you the home I always wanted to be able to give. But I don't want a home without you." Marcus sobbed, clinging to his mother. "I want you, Mom. Only you." Richard felt tears streaming down his own face. He wanted to leave the room, give them privacy, but Sarah held his hand with surprising strength for someone so sick. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice growing weaker. "Promise. Promise you'll love him as if he were your own. Promise you'll protect him. Promise you'll give him all the opportunities one never could. Please." Richard knelt beside the bed, holding Sarah's and Marcus's hands together. "I promise," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "On my life, on the memory of my late wife, I promise that Marcus will always have a home with me. That he'll always be loved. That he'll always be protected. You have my word." Sarah smiled through her tears. God bless you, she whispered. God bless you for being the angel he sent when I prayed for a miracle. They stayed there, the three of them united in a moment of pain, love, and promises, while snow began to fall again outside, covering Chicago in white silence. And although none of them knew it, this would be one of the last lucid conversations Sarah would have. The sand in the hourglass was running out, and Richard would have to keep his promise sooner than he imagined. Sarah Mitchell passed away 3 days later, in the early morning hours of December 29th, with Marcus sleeping in a chair beside her bed and Richard keeping silent watch near the window. There was no drama. There was no final struggle. She simply stopped breathing, like a candle that goes out softly. A nurse checked her vital signs and looked at Richard with deep sadness in her eyes. "She's gone," the nurse whispered. Richard looked at Marcus, still sleeping innocently, and felt his heart shatter. How would he tell this boy that the only person he had loved his entire life had just left him forever? He approached slowly and gently shook Marcus's shoulder. "Marcus," he said softly, "wake up, son." Marcus opened his eyes, disoriented for a moment. Then he saw Richard, saw the nurse, saw the expression on their faces. His eyes turned to Sarah, motionless and pale in the bed. "No," Marcus whispered, shaking his head. "No, no, no." He got up from the chair and ran to the bed, grabbing his mother's cold hand. "Mom, Mom, wake up. Please, Mom, wake up." Richard crossed the room and wrapped Marcus in his arms, gently pulling him away from the bed. The boy fought against him for a moment, then collapsed completely, his cries of agony echoing through the hospital corridor. "She's gone," Marcus sobbed against Richard's chest. "She left me. I'm alone. I'm completely alone." "No," Richard said firmly, holding Marcus tighter. "You're not alone. You'll never be alone. I'm here. I'm here, and I'm not leaving you." Marcus cried until he had no more tears. And Richard held him the entire time, his own tears falling silently as he thought about Catherine, about all the losses life forces us to face, and about how God has mysterious ways of healing old wounds through new ones. The funeral was held 2 days later, on December 31st. Victoria had insisted on organizing everything, a dignified service at Holy Name Cathedral, followed by burial at the peaceful Rose Hill Cemetery. The small chapel was surprisingly full. Besides the Montgomery family, there were nurses from the hospital who had cared for Sarah, social workers who knew her case, and even some customers from the cafeteria where she used to work before getting sick. Marcus sat in the front row between Richard and Victoria, wearing a black suit Victoria had rushed to order. He didn't cry during the service. He was beyond tears, in a state of silent shock that deeply worried Richard. During the homily, the priest spoke about Sarah as a dedicated mother who had sacrificed everything for her son. He spoke about unconditional love, about faith in difficult times, about how sometimes God works through people we would never expect. Sarah Mitchell asked God for a miracle, the priest said, and he answered, not in the way she expected, not by curing her illness, but by giving her the certainty that her son would be loved and cared for. Sometimes, the greatest miracles aren't about prolonging our own lives, but about ensuring that those we love will be okay when we leave. When the coffin was lowered into Chicago's frozen ground, covered by a thin layer of snow, that's when Marcus finally broke. He knelt on the cold grass, his small body shaking with silent sobs. Richard knelt beside him and placed his hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to cry," he said gently. "Crying means you loved. And love is never wasted." "I didn't tell her I loved her," Marcus sobbed. "The last time she was awake, I was angry because she was talking about leaving. I didn't tell her I loved her, and now she'll never know." "She knew," Richard said firmly, turning Marcus to face him. "Marcus, look at me. She knew. Every mother knows when she's loved by her child. She died in peace because she knew you loved her more than anything." How can you be sure? Because that was the last thing she told me, Richard replied, remembering those final words. She said, "Tell my Marcus that I died happy because I was loved by him every day of my life." She knew, son. She always knew. Marcus threw himself into Richard's arms and cried until he couldn't anymore. And Richard held him, rocking gently like he had seen parents do with small children, whispering words of comfort he didn't know he knew. New Year's Eve arrived, but there were no celebrations at the Montgomery house. Richard had cancelled the introduction dinner Victoria had planned. Instead, it was just him and Marcus in the apartment, the city exploding in fireworks outside, marking the beginning of 2020. Marcus was sitting by the window, looking at the colorful fireworks illuminating the sky over Chicago, but his eyes were empty. He had eaten almost nothing in 2 days. Barely spoke. He was trapped in a grief so deep that Richard didn't know how to reach him. "Marcus," Richard finally said, sitting beside him, "I know it seems impossible now, but I promise it will get better. The pain will never go away completely, but it will become more bearable." "How do you know?" Marcus asked, his voice emotionless. "Because I lost my wife 15 years ago," Richard admitted. "And I spent every day since then wishing I was dead too. The pain was so great I thought it would kill me. And in a way, it did. It killed the person I was and turned me into something cold and empty." Marcus looked at him, really looked, for the first time in days. "But then," Richard continued, "I found a brave boy looking for food in the trash behind a restaurant. And that boy reminded me that there were still reasons to live. That there was still love in the world. That there was still hope." "I don't feel brave," Marcus whispered. "I feel broken." "You're both," Richard said. "And it's okay to be broken right now. But I promise we'll put the pieces back together. One day at a time." Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then, so quietly Richard almost didn't hear, "Are you going to leave me too?" The question hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He pulled Marcus into his arms and held him with protective fierceness. "Never," he said, his voice filled with absolute conviction. "I promised your mother. I promised God. And I promise you now, I will never leave you. You're stuck with me, Marcus Mitchell, for better or worse, for the rest of my life." "Even when I'm difficult?" Marcus asked, his voice muffled against Richard's shoulder. "Especially when you're difficult. Even when I mess everything up? Even then? Even when I'm not good enough?" Richard pulled Marcus back to look directly into his eyes. "Marcus, listen carefully. You are more than good enough. You're amazing. You're brave. You're strong. And I'm lucky, so lucky to be your father." It was the first time Richard used the word father to refer to himself. And in saying it, he felt something click into place inside him. As if a piece that had been missing for 15 years had finally been found. Marcus looked at him with those huge brown eyes, and Richard saw something begin to ignite in them. Not happiness, it was still too early for that. But hope. A small spark of hope. Can I call you Dad?" Marcus asked timidly. Richard felt tears burn his eyes. "I would love that," he said, his voice hoarse. "Dad," Marcus tested the word, and then repeated with more confidence. "Dad." "Son," Richard responded, and the word came out as naturally as if he had said it his whole life. They hugged there, at the window overlooking Chicago exploding in fireworks, as one year ended and another began. The year Richard Montgomery had lost everything and found everything at the same time. Outside, the city celebrated. But inside the apartment, something deeper was happening. A family was being born from the ashes of tragedy. And although the road ahead would still be difficult, although there were tears and challenges to come, in that moment they had each other. And sometimes, that's all that matters. 6 weeks had passed since Sarah's funeral. Marcus was beginning to adapt to his new life, attending the prestigious Lincoln Park Academy, having weekly sessions with a child psychologist, and slowly learning to smile again. But the pain was still there, hidden just below the surface, ready to explode at the most unexpected moments. And then came the call that would change everything. Richard was in a crucial meeting with Japanese investors when his cell phone rang. He would normally ignore it, but saw it was Marcus's school. His heart immediately raced. "Excuse me," he said to the investors, answering quickly. "Hello, Mr. Montgomery." The principal's voice was tense, almost panicked. "You need to come to the school immediately. It's Marcus. There was an incident." Richard didn't remember leaving the meeting room. Didn't remember running through the corridors of his building. Didn't remember getting in the car. Everything was a blur until he was in front of Lincoln Park Academy, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would explode. The principal met him at the entrance, her expression grave. "Mr. Montgomery, before we see Marcus, I need to warn you that he got into a physical fight with another student. Something very serious happened." "Is he hurt?" Richard asked, his voice coming out louder than intended. "Not seriously, but Mr. Montgomery, the other boy is." Marcus attacked him with a violence that we've never seen in a child this age. Richard felt his blood freeze. "Marcus? His gentle, shy Marcus? Take me to him. Now." They found Marcus sitting alone in the principal's office, his knuckles scraped and bleeding, his school uniform torn. But what really shocked Richard were his eyes. They were empty, distant, as if Marcus had completely disconnected from reality. "Marcus," Richard said, kneeling in front of him. "What happened?" Silence. "Marcus, son, talk to me." "Nothing." The principal cleared her throat. "The other boy, Tyler Whitmore." Richard felt his stomach sink. Whitmore. As in Margaret Whitmore. The woman who had insulted Marcus that first night at Elenia. "What did he do?" Richard asked, his voice dangerously low. Apparently, Tyler made comments about Marcus's mother. Said cruel things about her dying because God was punishing poor people. Said Marcus was trash who should have died along with her. Richard felt a fury so intense rise within him that his hands began to tremble. But he forced himself to stay calm. For Marcus. And then Marcus attacked him? Not immediately, the principal continued, her voice softening. Witnesses said Marcus first tried to walk away. But Tyler followed him, pushed him against the wall and spit on him. Called his mother. Horrible words. That's when Marcus exploded. Richard looked at Marcus, who was still completely motionless, like a stone statue. And then he saw something that broke his heart, a single tear slowly rolling down the boy's cheek. "Marcus," Richard said gently, reaching for his hand. "It's okay. I'm not angry. I just need you to look at me." Slowly, very slowly, Marcus raised his eyes. And what Richard saw in them terrified him. It was pure hatred. Hatred and a pain so deep no child should carry. "He talked bad about my mom," Marcus said, his voice low and deadly. "He said she was trash. That she deserved to die. That I should be dead too. I know, son, I know." And everyone laughed. Marcus suddenly screamed, emotion finally exploding. Everyone just stood there and laughed when he said it. Nobody defended me. Nobody cared. He began crying uncontrollably, his whole body shaking. I wanted to kill him. I wanted to make it hurt as much as he hurt me. Is that wrong? Am I a monster for wanting that? Richard pulled Marcus into his arms and held him tight. No, you're not a monster. You're a child who's suffering. A child who lost his mother and is trying to survive in a world that's sometimes incredibly cruel. But I hurt someone, Marcus sobbed. I hit him over and over. I wanted him to suffer. And he did something unforgivable, Richard said firmly. He attacked your mother's memory. But Marcus, listen to me, violence isn't the answer. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because you deserve better. You deserve not to carry that weight of anger and hatred. The office door suddenly opened. Margaret Whitmore entered like a tornado, her son Tyler beside her with a black eye and swollen lip. You! She screamed, pointing at Marcus. You little savage! Look what you did to my son. I'm going to sue you and the entire Montgomery family for everything you have. Richard stood up slowly, placing himself protectively in front of Marcus. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice as icy as Chicago winter. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. Or what? She mocked. Are you going to threaten me too? Like father, like son. This boy is violent, uncontrolled, a threat. This boy, Richard cut her off, his voice now thundering through the room, was brutally provoked by your son, who apparently inherited your cruelty. Your son verbally attacked an orphan child about his mother's death. And before you think about suing anyone, you should know I have 5 witnesses willing to testify about what Tyler said. Margaret went pale. My son would never. Your son, Richard continued relentlessly, spit on Marcus and said, and I quote from witness testimony, your trashy mother died because even God didn't want poor people polluting heaven. Do you really want to continue this conversation, Margaret? The silence was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Tyler began to cry, hiding his face in his mother's coat. Margaret opened and closed her mouth several times, completely speechless. You Montgomerys think you can buy everything, she finally spat with venom. You think you can take a street kid and turn him into one of us. But he never will be. He'll always be trash, no matter how many zeros are in his bank account. That was too far. Richard crossed the room in 3 steps and stood face to face with Margaret. Get out of my sight, he said, each word loaded with deadly threat. Before I forget I was raised to be a gentleman. Margaret backed away, genuinely frightened. She grabbed Tyler and ran out of the office. Richard turned back to Marcus, who was trembling. It's all okay now, he said softly. It's over. But Marcus shook his head. It's not. She's right. I don't belong in this world. I'm different. I'll always be the poor boy who was adopted out of pity. Stop. Richard shouted, startling Marcus. He had never raised his voice to the boy before. Stop saying those things. You think I adopted you out of pity? You think your mother meant nothing to me. Tears were streaming down Richard's face now. Marcus, you saved me. When I found you in that alley, I was dead inside. I spent 15 years just existing, not living. And then I saw you, this brave, strong boy who would do anything for his mother. And something inside me woke up. He knelt down, holding Marcus's face between his hands. You're not my charity project. You're my son. My son. And I don't care what Margaret Whitmore or anyone else in this pathetic city thinks. You're a Montgomery because I chose you. Because I love you. It was the first time Richard had said those words. And in saying them, he felt the last wall around his heart finally collapse completely. Marcus looked at Richard, his eyes filled with tears, vulnerability, and a hope so fragile it could break with a touch. You love me, he whispered. Yes, Richard said without hesitation. I love you as if you were born from my blood. As if your mother had been my wife. As if you were the son Catherine and I could never have. I love you more than my own life. Marcus threw himself into Richard's arms and burst into a cry so intense, so cathartic, that the principal discreetly left the room to give them privacy. "I love you too, Dad," Marcus sobbed. "I'm so afraid of disappointing you. So afraid that you'll wake up one day and realize you made a mistake." "Impossible," Richard said firmly. "You're the best decision I've ever made. The only right thing I've done in 15 years. They stayed there, embraced, crying together, while the storm finally passed. And when they finally separated, there was something different between them. A deeper connection. An unconditional love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. "Let's go home," Richard said, wiping Marcus's tears. "Home," Marcus repeated, and for the first time, the words sounded true. 5 years later, snow fell softly over Rose Hill Cemetery as Richard and Marcus walked side by side among the white-covered headstones. It was Christmas Eve 2025, and this visit had become a sacred tradition between them. Marcus was now 13 years old. He had grown considerably. He was almost shoulder height to Richard. His face still maintained that gentleness in his eyes, but there was a confidence there that didn't exist before. He wore an expensive winter coat but carried a simple cardboard box under his arm. They stopped in front of Sarah Mitchell's headstone. Richard had commissioned an elaborate memorial in Italian marble, with an engraving of an angel protecting a child. The carved words read, "Sarah Mitchell, extraordinary mother, tireless warrior, eternal guardian angel." Marcus knelt in the snow and placed a bouquet of white lilies, his mother's favorite flowers, in front of the headstone. "Hi, Mom," he said softly, his voice now deeper. "I brought Dad with me again. I know you'd like to know that he finally learned how to make pancakes without burning them." Richard laughed, wiping away a tear. Even after 5 years, these visits still moved him deeply. "And Mom," Marcus continued, his voice becoming more serious, "there's something I need to tell you. Something we discovered yesterday. Something that changes everything." Richard placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder, encouraging him. Marcus opened the cardboard box and took out some old, yellowed papers. "Remember when you always said I was your miracle? That God sent me to you." Tears began streaming down his face. "It turns out that I wasn't just your miracle, Mom. I was someone else's miracle too." Richard took a deep breath. What they had discovered the day before still seemed impossible. But the documents didn't lie. My psychologist, Dr. Ellen Morrison, was helping Dad organize my final adoption process, Marcus explained, his voice trembling. She found something in the old hospital records. Something that social workers had misfiled years ago. He held the old papers with trembling hands. "Mom, do you remember when you told me about my biological father? That he was a rich man who abandoned you when he found out you were pregnant? That you never told me his name because you wanted to protect me from being rejected?" Marcus paused, swallowing hard. His name was in the medical records. Richard Montgomery. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind blowing through the trees. "Not this Richard Montgomery," Marcus quickly clarified. But Richard Montgomery Sr. My dad's father." Richard closed his eyes, tears falling freely now. They had discovered the impossible truth the day before. Sarah had worked as a waitress at a charity event 14 years ago. Richard Sr., Richard's father, had flirted with her, taken her to a hotel, promised her the world. And then disappeared when she said she was pregnant. Sarah never knew he had died of a heart attack 3 months later. Never knew he had left a letter confessing the affair and asking the family to find the child. A letter Victoria had hidden out of shame, to protect the family name. A letter that was only discovered when Victoria, 5 years after meeting Marcus, finally had the courage to confess the truth. "Mom," Marcus continued, his voice breaking completely, "I didn't find you by chance in that alley. God didn't send me to a stranger. He brought me home. To my real home. To my older brother. The revelation hit Marcus again with full force. Richard wasn't just the man who adopted him. Richard was his blood brother. They shared the same father. When I found out yesterday, Marcus sobbed, I was so scared. Scared it would change everything. Scared that Dad would see me differently. But you know what he said. Marcus turned to look at Richard, whose face was covered with tears. He said it didn't change anything. That he already loved me as a son. That blood or not, I would always be his son. But, Mom. Marcus laughed through his tears. But it means you didn't fail. It means you succeeded. You managed to bring me to the man my biological father should have been. You managed to give me the family we always deserved. Richard knelt beside Marcus and hugged his brother-son tightly. And she gave me something I didn't know I had, Richard said, looking at the headstone. Sarah, you gave me a brother. A son. A second chance at having family. Thank you. Thank you for being strong enough to survive alone. Thank you for raising this incredible boy. Thank you for having faith that God would bring him back home. Marcus buried his face in Richard's shoulder. I still call you Dad, right? Because you are my dad. Blood doesn't matter. Blood doesn't matter, Richard agreed. But Marcus, now you're officially a Montgomery by adoption and by blood. You belong here in every way possible. They stayed there embraced for a long time, letting the impossible and wonderful truth of the situation sink in. God had a sense of humor and a plan no human could predict. Finally, they stood up. Marcus placed his hand on his mother's headstone. Thank you, Mom, he whispered. Thank you for never giving up. Thank you for loving me enough to let me go when the time came. And thank you for knowing that God had a plan, even when it seemed like all was lost. They began walking back to the car. The snow had stopped, and the sun was beginning to emerge through the clouds, bathing the cemetery in golden light. Dad, Marcus said suddenly, stopping. You know what I realized? What? That night, when you found me in the alley, you said I was looking for food in the trash behind Alinea, right? Yes. That restaurant is 2 blocks from the Montgomery Capitol building. I could have gone to any restaurant in Chicago. But I went to that one. On that specific night. At the exact moment you were passing by. Richard felt chills run down his spine. It wasn't chance, Marcus said with absolute conviction. It was destiny. It was God. It was my mother from heaven guiding my steps. Everything was planned so I would find my family. Richard pulled Marcus into another tight hug. Your mother was right about one thing, he said. You really are a miracle. The miracle that saved this entire family. Christmas dinner at the Montgomery mansion was in full swing. The house was filled with laughter, music, and warmth. Victoria sat at the head of the table, proud and smiling, watching her grown and happy family. James and Emma were there, along with several other cousins, uncles, and friends. And at the center of it all was Marcus, now officially Marcus James Montgomery, telling stories and making everyone laugh. Richard watched from his chair, a permanent smile on his face. He thought about how his life had changed that Christmas Eve 5 years ago. How a hungry boy had given him back his humanity. How the death of a brave woman had given life to a family. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Dr. Ellen Morrison, Marcus's psychologist, with an attached photo. It was the letter Richard Sr. had written before he died, begging the family to find his son. The last line read, "If you find my boy, please tell him I'm sorry. And tell him I hope God sends someone better than me to love him the way he deserves." Richard looked at Marcus, who was now showing magic tricks to Emma, both laughing hysterically. "He did, Dad," Richard whispered to the sky. God sent him back to me. And I'll spend every day of my life being the father and brother you should have been. The snow began to fall again outside, covering Chicago in white magic. And inside the Montgomery house, a family born of tragedy, forged in love, and sealed by divine destiny celebrated the Christmas Eve miracle that changed everything. The miracle of Marcus Montgomery. The boy who was searching for food in the trash and found a home. The boy who saved a lonely millionaire from himself. The boy who proved that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unlikely places. And that God, indeed, works in mysterious ways. So, what did you think? If this story moved you, hit that like button and comment below which part touched you the most. Was it the encounter in the alley? Sarah's goodbye? Or that final revelation no one expected? I read all the comments. Don't forget. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next emotional stories. There's much more coming. And if you enjoyed it, go on a binge of the other stories here on the channel. I guarantee you'll be just as moved. Thank you so much. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching until the end. Share this with someone who needs to believe in miracles today. May God bless you and your family. A big hug and see you next time.